In this video, I'm going to be sharing 15 very common mistakes that new players make when they first pick up Skyrim. And make sure you stick around until the end because number 15 is quite literally a matter of life and death. Now, the first mistake I want to talk about is one that can completely ruin your playthrough, and that's falling into the level scaling trap. Basically, Skyrim features a level scaling system, which means that as your character levels up, the majority of your enemies will level up with you. This isn't a problem in of itself, and it actually ensures that the game remains challenging as you reach higher levels. However, it can also inadvertently create a trap where new players can accidentally make the game significantly harder for themselves. This is due to the fact that in Skyrim, the only way to gain experience towards your character level is by leveling up your skills, and that includes all skills, even the non-combat ones. Let me give you an example of how this can go wrong. Say you start the game by spending hours grinding, smithing, enchanting and alchemy with the intention of crafting yourself some powerful weapons and armor before you head off on your adventures. That seems like a totally legitimate and sensible strategy, right? Well, in Skyrim, it really isn't, as by leveling these skills, your character's level is going to shoot up pretty quickly, and as a result, your enemies are going to scale up with you. Why is this a problem? Well, you haven't even touched your combat skills at this point, which means that your enemies have a massive health pool and they're hitting like trucks, and in return you're basically hitting them with a wet noodle and getting obliterated in a couple of hits. That's the level scaling trap, and in this example you've fallen right into it, so don't do that. The best way to avoid this trap is to just take a more balanced approach to leveling. Make sure that you're focusing on leveling at least one combat skill as you progress your crafting skills, so then when it comes to fighting the scaled up enemies, you can give as good as you get. This actually leads neatly into tip number 2, which is to avoid being a jack of all trades, as in spreading yourself too thinly across too many skills. Skyrim's skill system does let you do anything and everything, which is awesome, but if you try to do it all at once, you'll end up with a very mediocre build in the early game. New players often spread their perk points and skill training too thin. A little in one hand, a little in two hand, a perk in destruction, one in sneaking, one in smithing, and so on. Then, before you know it, you've got 10 skills at apprentice level and none at adept or above, and you're wondering why enemies seem to be so tanky and why your attacks feel so weak. Basically, despite the game allowing you to go in any direction you please with your build, the reality is that it's actually balanced around you having at least some form of specialization. That is if you're not playing on anything but the absolute lowest difficulty settings. If you try to become the master of everything from the get-go, then you're going to miss out on some significant power spikes that come from specializing in any given skill, which is going to make the game feel harder and combat less satisfying. For instance, if you were alternating between using bows, greatswords, and say spells, then none of those skills are going to level as fast as if you were focusing on just one of them. And as a result, enemies are going to be just eating your weak firebolts for breakfast and shrugging off your flimsy sword swings. I'd suggest avoiding this issue by picking one or two primary combat styles and focusing your early perks in the perk trees that correspond to those skills. Then, once you've fleshed out those primary skills, start looking at how you might want to branch out and diversify your build. Also, remember that you can go back to these standing stones at any time if you want to change your blessing to focus on a different set of skills, which makes fleshing out a more diverse build a little less painful. Word of warning here though, regardless of standing stone blessings, the skills you level later in the game are going to take a lot longer than those that you focus on in the early game, which means that while perk points are fairly easy to come by early in the game, as you progress they are going to become more and more difficult to obtain. This is because as your character levels up, you'll require more and more experience from using your skills to reach the next level. The problem here is that you only gain a single perk point per level, so tip number 3 is to be very careful not to waste those perks. Not only do they get harder and harder to come by as you progress the game, it's also a pretty painful process to reset them. You basically have two choices. The first one is to legendary a skill by getting it to max level and then resetting it to refund the perk points, which is massively time consuming. Or you can use the perk reset system from the Dragonborn DLC, which requires you to firstly complete the Dragonborn DLC, which isn't quick, and then to provide a dragon soul in order to refund your perks from a particular perk tree. If you want to learn more about either of those processes, then I'll link my leveling and skills guide in the description down below. Basically, I'd recommend having at least a rough plan for how you want to spend your perks, using them to flesh out your primary combat skills early on rather than spreading them too thinly between multiple skills. Otherwise, you're going to have a very long and tedious journey to unlocking some of the more impactful and interesting perks in your primary skill trees. And as a result, you're going to miss out on some of the associated power spikes as well as the simple satisfaction of getting to unlock and use them. Now, regardless of which skills and perks you go for, I'd suggest including at least one ranged option. And that's because Skyrim will sometimes pretty much force you to engage in ranged combat, notably when fighting dragons, but also when engaging enemies positioned high up on castle walls, for example. Technically, you can reach any of these enemies with melee weapons, as you can climb any of these structures, and dragons, for the most part, will eventually land. Though, actually, to be fair, that's not necessarily always true, as when dragons attack you in certain towns, they'll sometimes literally only land on roofs, which can actually cause some serious problems, as while the guards will eventually kill them, they'll take a long time to do so, and during that time, the dragon can easily kill some NPCs that might in turn lock you out of certain quests permanently. So I'd recommend avoiding this issue by always carrying some form of ranged weapon or learning some basic destruction magic spells such as Firebolt or Ice Spike early on. Then of course you're going to actually want to use these skills a decent amount to ensure that they aren't going to be pathetically weak when you actually need to call on them. If you have the Sovngarde DLC installed, then I'd recommend using crossbows as your ranged option, as you unlock them very early in that expansion storyline, and they pack a serious punch without you even needing to invest any perk points in the archery skill tree. Another often overlooked range tool is actually shouts. Dragon Rend, which you learn later in the main quest, is actually designed to force dragons to land by crippling their ability to fly, which is extremely handy when dealing with annoying random dragon attacks. But even before you get that, the Unrelenting Force shout, which is the first shout you unlock, can be useful at a short range for doing stuff like staggering enemies or interrupting spellcasters, which again can be pretty useful in a pinch. And that actually brings me on to my next new player mistake, and that's forgetting to use your shouts and racial powers entirely. So many new players just completely forget that shouts exist, despite them being such a core part of the Dragonborn's toolkit. It's understandable, I did exactly the same thing in my first playthrough. Skyrim does give you a lot of tools, and sometimes players just want to stick to swinging swords and casting spells, and it's quite easy to forget that shouts are there as well. It's fair to say that some of the shouts are pretty lackluster, but others are insanely powerful when used with the right build. For example, using the Elemental Fury shout to buff your weapon swing speed can turn you into an absolute monster with melee weapons. And the same's true for racial powers. Some of them absolutely suck, but others are seriously overpowered. For example, an Orc's Berserker Rage doubles your damage whilst halving all incoming damage, which can easily swing a boss fight in your favour, and a Breton's Dragon Skin allows them to absorb magicka from spells, which can easily save you from being incinerated by a dragon, for example. These racial abilities can only be used once per in-game day, so save them for a clutch moment, but do remember to use them. They can have serious impact, especially at higher difficulty settings. Speaking of special powers, you can unlock the special powers of a Vress Games YouTube membership, including bonus guides, RPG discussion videos, and other RPG related content. And I also have a Patreon if you want to unlock all of these benefits, as well as some extras such as private Discord channel access to ask me questions directly, and a number of other benefits such as having your name in the credits of my videos. You can find links to become a YouTube or Patreon member in the description down below. And yes, I know my segues into this plug are becoming increasingly awful. Anyway, let's move on to mistake number 6. And that is that many RPG players in general have a terrible habit of hoarding potions and consumables and never using them. This is another one that I'm absolutely guilty of in pretty much every RPG I play. I'm always saving my consumables to use them in that perfect moment. But of course that moment never arrives, and then by the end of the game I'm still sat with 50 minor health potions in my inventory. So don't make that mistake when it comes to Skyrim. Potions and other consumables in this game are plentiful, and you can even produce them yourself through the alchemy skill. So unless you're holding on to something particularly special or rare, then don't be shy with your consumables. They can easily swing a more challenging fight in your favour. For example, using a fire resistance potion to deal with enemy mages, or a fortified damage potion to give you the edge in a dungeon that's just slightly above your current level. However, no amount of potions are going to save you from one particularly notorious enemy type in the early game. I am of course referring to giants. Those 15-foot tall hairy dudes herding mammoths across the plains. You will inevitably encounter them as you explore the open world, and you may therefore think that they are a normal enemy to engage in combat. Well, they're not. Giants have a static level of I think 32, meaning that they are way stronger than you in the early game. And if you attempt to fight them at this early stage, you will, as one of my YouTube commenters put it, be quickly introduced to the Skyrim space program, which is actually a hilarious bug and something of a rite of passage for new players. So while I say don't make this mistake, I actually mean save the game before you get to a giant camp and then let them launch you into the great dark beyond, as every player needs to experience this at least once. Which leads to my next new player mistake actually, forgetting to save. Nothing is more heartbreaking than clearing a massive dungeon and then getting killed by a particularly challenging boss or annoying trap, only to realise that your last save was at the beginning of the dungeon an hour ago. It's often the case that new players rely too much on autosave and neglect to save manually. Now the problem with this is that autosave primarily happens when you load into a new zone, meaning that if you're exploring the open world for example, you could go for hours without hitting an autosave, and then lose all of that process when a giant launches you into the upper atmosphere for stepping a little too close to his mammoth herd. The quick save key on PC is F5 and I'd suggest pressing it often, particularly when you're about to go into a challenging fight, but it's also worth just getting in the habit of saving periodically just in case. Then of course it's up to you as to how much you want to save scum. Saving before every lockpick or pickpocket for example is where I draw the line, but you do you. Moving on to mistake number 9, which is rushing straight into the main quest. There's of course nothing wrong with doing this if it's what you want to do, but as a new player you may not realise that you have many other options. You might not realise this as the game does strongly encourage you to follow the main quest path from the very early stages of the game, with the opening sequence around Helgen and the following quest objectives being centred on that main narrative. However, in my opinion, Skyrim truly shines when you explore and take your time. If you just blindly follow the main quest and then assume you've finished the game, you'll miss out on dozens of side quests, guild storylines, and plenty of hidden adventures that really flesh out the world. Plus, advancing the main quest too quickly does have its downsides. For example, once you kill your first dragon for Jarl Balgruuf, random dragon attacks will start occurring all over Skyrim. This means that towns can be attacked by dragons, and then NPCs, such as shopkeepers and quest givers, can die in the crossfire, and I mean permanently die. And to be honest, random dragon attacks can be pretty annoying when you're trying to get on with a different activity. Also, when it comes to higher difficulty settings, you're going to want to flesh out your build a bit before facing some of the tougher enemies that you'll encounter as part of the main story. Most notably the various dragons, but there are also some other challenging encounters such as the notoriously annoying troll on the way up to High Hrothgar. Many long-time players will be very familiar with this troll. The trade-off is that if you don't unlock dragons, you also don't unlock shouts, so that's a decision you'll need to make for yourself. Whichever direction you take, I can guarantee one thing, and that is that you're going to come across a lot of loot, and I mean a lot. In Skyrim, you can pick up cabbages, swords, dragon bones, and every item of clothing from enemies you defeat. However, at some point, encumbrance will get the better of you. It's quite common for new players to grab pretty much everything that's not literally nailed to the floor, every iron sword, every tankard, every wolf pelt, until suddenly your character starts walking like they're wading through treacle. This is the first telltale sign that you're over encumbered. And as well as moving at a snail's pace, you also can't run or fast travel in this state, which will turn a quick dungeon exit into a slow and tedious march. Inevitably, you'll end up having to drop some items to get yourself moving again, and those items may well be something that you either want or need, which is less than ideal. The best way to avoid this problem is to be selective. Manage your inventory wisely and target items with a favourable weight to value ratio, such as potions, gems, jewellery and light armour. I'd also advise grabbing a follower early on so that you can massively expand your inventory by making them carry your items. And it's also worth getting a player house so you've got a safe place to store items that you're not ready to use yet, but also that you don't wish to sell. Your knees will certainly thank you for doing this, and you won't end up wasting gold or useful items by having to dump them in the depths of a dungeon that you have no plans to return to. A related mistake that people make is to go wild on stealing as soon as they realise that it's a feature in the game, and that it's fairly easy to pull off once you work out that you can break into NPCs' shops and houses at night. However, don't go on a klepto spree until you've unlocked the ability to use a fence, which is something you can achieve by joining the Thieves Guild. I'll share a video on how to do that in the description down below. The reason I say this is that you're going to end up stuck with these items over encumbering you, as you'll have no way of shifting them. And what's worse is if you get caught by a guard for any crime, however minor and unrelated to your theft, they will confiscate every single stolen item from your inventory, potentially losing you thousands of gold. As I've already said, the primary way to avoid this issue is by joining the Thieves Guild and making use of a fence to flog your stolen goods. However, there is also a sneaky second method for dealing with certain types of stolen goods. Basically, if you use a stolen material to craft an item, such as a weapon or potion, then the resulting item doesn't flag as stolen. This means you can effectively launder stolen materials through smithing, alchemy, enchanting, and cooking, which can also make you shed loads of extra gold. So if you fancy a little crime spree before you join the Thieves Guild, then target the alchemy, enchanting, and blacksmith shops so that you can easily cover your tracks. Now, I already mentioned followers, and early in the game you will have plenty of opportunities to recruit various followers such as Lydia, Thaindel, and plenty of others, and they can offer a number of benefits. But they're also quite easy to kill by accident. Let me play out a scenario with you. You're in a chaotic fight, spells are flying, swords are swinging, and then you accidentally roast your follower with a fireball or blast them off a cliff with a dragon shout. Now, as hilarious as that might be, it's actually more than just a mild inconvenience in many cases. And that's because many followers in Skyrim are non-essential NPCs, which means that once they're dead permanently. And even worse, if they were carrying many of your heavy items, yeah, well, good luck getting those items back to town by yourself. You can avoid this issue by being more careful in combat, watching your melee swings and avoiding area of effect spells. However, that makes combat feel less fun in my opinion, so I'd recommend just recruiting a follower who can't die, such as Serana, due to their status as an essential NPC. Something else that you can do accidentally, believe it or not, is becoming a vampire. One minute you're fighting vampires in a creepy old ruin, feeling good about the service you're providing to the Dawnguard, and the next you're hissing at sunlight and NPCs are avoiding you or even attacking you. This actually happens quite a lot to new players and often results in a lot of confusion. Basically what happens is, when you're fighting a vampire, their vampiric drain ability has the chance to infect you with Sanguinare Vampiris, a disease that gradually turns you into the vampire over the course of 3 in-game days. It's a fairly subtle process and you can quite easily ignore it or just dismiss it as part of a side quest that you're not currently focusing on. But if you do, you'll miss the opportunity to easily cure it during the early stages and you'll actually become a full-blown vampire, which requires a more arduous cure. That is unless you want to be a vampire, of course, which does offer a number of pros such as enhanced abilities, but it also offers a number of cons such as being weaker in sunlight, being weak to fire, and the fact that many NPCs will hate and refuse to interact with you unless you have the Dawnguard DLC installed. You can avoid this problem entirely by using the Cure Disease potion, consuming hawk feathers, or visiting any shrine during the 3-day window in which you've contracted the disease but haven't become a full-blown vampire yet. And if you forget to do that, then you can travel to Morfell and complete a side quest to cure yourself of full vampirism. That's a bit of a lengthy process, so I'll link my detailed vampirism guide in the description down below for those who want to know how to do that step by step. Now, the next mistake I want to bring up isn't exactly a game mechanic, but more of a mindset around difficulty settings. A lot of new players, especially RPG veterans, might start the game on a high difficulty setting and then stubbornly stick to it even if they're having a rough time. They might not want to back down from a challenge, fair enough, or they might just think that playing on a higher difficulty setting will give a better experience, not realizing that higher difficulty in Skyrim mostly just makes enemies spongier and you squishier, rather than adding any kind of challenging skill-based mechanics. Here's the thing, Skyrim's meant to be enjoyable, not a slog. If you find yourself dying repeatedly or that a particular encounter is no fun because it's so spongy, then don't hesitate to dynamically lower the difficulty, which Skyrim allows you to do through the game's menu at any time, even if it's just to get through that encounter. Conversely, if you're breezing through too easily and getting bored, then you can raise it back up. At this point, Skyrim is a pretty old game, and admittedly, its scaling isn't perfect. So sometimes it just makes sense to tweak the difficulty slightly when you run into an annoyingly difficult wall for seemingly no reason at all. In my view, the difficulty option should be treated as a tool for your enjoyment. And let's be realistic, it's not like Skyrim is a competitive game by any stretch of the imagination, so just have fun with it. Finally, this leads us to the single biggest mistake you can make in Skyrim, the irreversible public relations move that will unite this war-torn province in their unrelenting hatred for you. And that is harming Skyrim's most revered creature, the humble chicken. They might look like just another meal to you, but in Skyrim they're practically royalty. New players often make the foul mistake, get it, of attacking a chicken. probably thinking it will yield a cooking ingredient or two. Well, they're not wrong in that regard, but what you might not be expecting is that harming a single feather on the back of one of Skyrim's highly worshipped chickens will send the entire village or town berserk. Forget about Alduin the World Eater, you will instantly become the #1 most reviled creature in the whole of Skyrim. Don't believe me? Go ahead and punch the first chicken you come across in Riverwood and see for yourself. When it comes to chickens, the citizens of Skyrim do not mess around. Now that should put you in a pretty solid position to start your adventures in Skyrim without making some of these common mistakes. But there's still plenty to learn, and I have tons more Skyrim guide content on my channel, and as I already mentioned, even more to offer through Patreon and YouTube membership as well. So check that out by following the links in the description down below, and as always, thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.